All right, ready to dive into something pretty interesting. We're tackling Good Samaritan laws today. You might think you know them, but
Yeah.
there's probably more to it than you realize. Like, did you know these laws are actually there to protect you if you jump in
Right.
to help someone who's hurt, or in danger?
hmm
They're all about preventing those, what if I make things worse, fears.
Yeah.
So people are more likely to actually lend a hand.
It really is a fascinating concept when you think about it. It gets right at how different societies, try to balance individual freedom with that responsibility we have to each other, right?
Yeah,
So we're using Wikipedia's article on Good Samaritan laws as our guide today, sort of a map for our exploration, you could say.
I like it.
Yeah.
I've always wondered about this, especially when you hear those stories, people hesitating to help because they're afraid of getting sued.
Oh, absolutely.
So, basics first. What exactly are Good Samaritan laws?
At their core, they protect everyday people from legal trouble, liability. If they accidentally cause harm while trying to help someone who needs it, the whole point is to encourage people to step in without that fear of a lawsuit hanging over their head, even if things, go wrong.
So it's like a safety net for people who want to do the right thing but are worried about the consequences.
Exactly. Of course, there are limits. It's not a license to practice medicine if you don't have one, right?
Oh, right.
It's about reasonable assistance, doing what you can sensibly, not going all rogue and doing something crazy dangerous.
Makes sense. You can't just break out your rusty toolbox and, pretend to be a surgeon.
Uh-huh. Right.
So how do these laws actually play out around the world? Are they basically the same everywhere, or do things get a little,
Oh, it gets interesting, trust me.
Okay, good. I was hoping you'd say that.
The approaches to encouraging this helping behavior, they vary so much globally. Some countries have these very detailed, specific Good Samaritan laws,
Okay.
while others rely on just broader legal principles.
All right, I'm hooked. Give me some examples. Where do we see these differences in action?
Let's start with, let's say, Australia. Most of their states have some kind of Good Samaritan protection, but how much it covers can be really different. Like in New South Wales, you might not be protected if you were involved in causing the injury in the first place.
Oh, wow.
But then you've got Victoria, where you're usually covered as long as you're acting in good faith. Even if you accidentally trip someone and they break their ankle, you're probably okay.
So your location within Australia could actually make a huge difference in whether or not you're legally protected.
Exactly. And that's just one country. When you zoom out to the global picture, things get even more diverse.
I bet.
Take Belgium, for example. They've got a very direct approach. Their law actually makes it a legal duty to help someone in danger as long as you aren't putting yourself or others at risk by doing so.
Wait, so in Belgium, you could get in trouble for not helping someone? That's a whole other way of looking at it.
It really is. It gets at the heart of how societies see this whole responsibility to help each other, right? Some, like Belgium, consider it a civic duty. Others, like the U.S., generally focus more on removing the legal roadblocks to people helping voluntarily.
Okay, so we've got Australia with its regional quirks, Belgium with its mandatory helping. What about Canada? How do they handle this Good Samaritan thing?
Well, Canada's system mirrors their federal structure, so each province has its own Good Samaritan Act. You've got places like Ontario and British Columbia with acts specifically protecting those who help voluntarily, not expecting to get paid. But then you've got Quebec.
Right.
They operate under civil law, and their Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms actually includes a general duty to rescue.
So kind of like Belgium, Quebec sees helping those in need as a fundamental right, not just a good deed.
Exactly. A really fascinating example of how even within one country, you can have totally different legal and philosophical approaches.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. What about a country with a completely different legal and social context like China?
Okay, yeah.
I know they've had some high-profile cases where people were really hesitant to help for fear of legal repercussions.
You're right. For a long time, China didn't have specific Good Samaritan laws, which led to this, reluctance to get involved when someone needed help. But then you had a few high-profile incidents, public outcry, national conversation, and in 2013, Shenzhen introduced the country's first Good Samaritan law. And just a few years later, in 2017, a national law came into effect.
So they went from basically no legal protection for Good Samaritans to a nationwide law in just a few years. That's a pretty big change.
It is. Shows how societal attitudes and legal stuff can change, adapt when things happen.
Right.
And speaking of unique approaches, Finland Their Rescue Act, it's got this interesting twist.
Ooh, I love a good twist. Lay it on me.
So they have this explicit duty to rescue, but it incorporates the principle of proportionality, meaning professionals like doctors, firefighters, they're expected to do more than someone without that specialized training.
Oh, that makes sense.
It recognizes that different people can do different things in an emergency, you know?
Right. You wouldn't expect someone who knows basic first aid to suddenly, like, perform surgery on the side of the road.
Exactly. It's about reasonable expectations based on what you know and can do. Now, hop over to France with me, mentally, of course. They have a strong duty to assist, too. Their law says anyone has to help a person in danger, or at least call for help.
So just like in Belgium and in parts of Canada, you
Yeah.
can't just walk by someone who needs help in France.
Right. And while they're not on the hook for damages if they act in good faith, there can be consequences if they intentionally cause harm or make a strong mistake.
So they encourage you to help, but they also hold you to a certain standard of care. It's a,
Yeah,
it's a tough line to walk, isn't it?
it really is.
Okay, so what about Germany then? Do they have a similar setup?
Germany's got its own thing going on. They don't actually have a specific Good Samaritan law, but their criminal code has this provision that punishes people for not giving first aid to someone in need. It's less about encouraging help and more about, well, penalizing inaction.
Wow, almost the opposite of how the U.S. does it. But what if someone does try to help and ends up making things worse? Are they still in trouble?
That's where it gets interesting. Even if your efforts don't work out, they won't come after you legally as long as you were genuinely trying to help.
Oh, okay.
It's all about encouraging people to act, not be frozen by fear, even if things don't go perfectly.
I like that. Take some of the pressure off, knowing you won't be punished for doing your best, even if it doesn't work out.
Absolutely. Now, let's jump over to a country with a totally different legal system, India. They've got this Good Samaritan law specifically focused on encouraging people to help road accident victims.
Makes sense with all the traffic accidents they have there. It's a very practical approach to a serious issue.
Right. They recognize that in those situations, getting medical care fast within that crucial golden hour can mean life or death.
Right.
So they've made a law specifically to protect people who step up to help in those moments.
Very direct response to a very real problem. What about Ireland? Have they done anything similar?
Ireland's approach is interesting. In 2011, they brought in legislation that directly addresses the liability of Good Samaritans and volunteers. Doesn't force people to step in,
Okay.
but it does protect them from being held liable for what they do while helping, unless they were acting in bad faith or were grossly negligent.
So they're not obligated to help, but if they do, they're generally shielded from lawsuits.
You got it. It encourages volunteerism without making it a legal requirement. Okay, how about we move on to Israel, a country that's, known for its emphasis on community responsibility.
All right, I'm listening. What's their take on these laws?
Their law is actually kind of similar to France's, requires people to help someone in danger or at least call for help. And just like France, if you act in good faith, you're protected from liability for unintentional damages.
So again, this balancing act between requiring people to help, but then protecting them when they do.
Hmm?
Okay, what about Japan? Same idea.
Japan's interesting. They don't have an official Good Samaritan law. However, their penal and civil codes actually have provisions that offer similar protections. It's like the idea is built into their whole legal system.
Really? So even without a specific law, they still acknowledge how important it is to protect people who are trying to help. That's pretty neat.
It is. For example, their penal code basically says if you do something out of necessity to prevent danger, it's not punishable, as long as the harm you caused is less than the harm you were trying to prevent.
So like if you have to break a car window to rescue someone trapped inside during a fire, you're not going to get charged with property damage.
Precisely. Sometimes you have to do things to help others, even if it might technically break other rules.
Yeah, definitely. It's fascinating how different legal systems handle those situations. Okay, what about Romania? Anything noteworthy there?
Romania stands out because they actually have something specific in their health reform law. Protects people who provide basic first aid, even if they don't have medical training.
Interesting.
As long as they're acting in good faith, following instructions from medical pros, or using their own knowledge, they're good legally.
So even if you're not a doctor or nurse, you can still help in an emergency without worrying about being sued?
Yep, it empowers people to make a difference. Now let's shift gears to the Middle East, specifically the UAE. They made history in 2020.
Ooh, tell me more. Sounds like a big deal.
Big deal indeed. They were the first Arab country to pass a Good Samaritan law. Shows how this concept is gaining ground around the world.
That's really cool. It does seem like the idea of legally protecting people who choose to help is spreading.
It is. Okay, let's swing back over to the UK for a sec. Like Japan, they don't have a specific Good Samaritan law, but they do have the Social Action Responsibility and Heroism Act of 2015.
That's quite a name. What's it all about?
Basically, it's designed to protect people who are acting responsibly in social situations, which includes Good Samaritans. It gives courts more flexibility to consider the context when someone's being accused of negligence or breaching a duty.
So if you try to help and things go south, the courts are more likely to consider your good intentions.
That's the gist, yeah. Not a foolproof guarantee, but it's a step towards recognizing the importance of encouraging people to do the right thing.
It seems like a lot of countries are trying to figure out how to handle this, each in their own way.
They are.
Now, we can't talk about Good Samaritan laws without talking about the U.S., right? It's kind of all over the place there, isn't it?
It is. All 50 states and D.C. have some form of these laws, but the details. Totally different. Some states offer broad protection, others are much more limited. It just shows that even within one country, you can have a huge variety of legal approaches.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. So many different approaches. It's amazing how much variation there is around the world.
It's fascinating. Right.
Definitely makes you think. Before we get into some of the specifics, those common features and nuances of these laws,
Sure.
let's touch on something you mentioned before. Countries that don't have any Good Samaritan laws.
Right. It's important to remember that not every country has officially put this kind of protection into law. Some notable examples: Pakistan, South Africa, New Zealand, Singapore, and the Philippines.
Huh. Makes you wonder how things play out there without that legal safety net.
Hmm.
Do they have different cultural approach, or is it just, a matter of legal history?
Hard to say without really digging into each individual situation. It's probably a mix of things.
Hmm?
Cultural norms, history, maybe even just a lack of awareness about the need for these kinds of laws.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions. This has really been eye-opening. It's not just about the laws themselves, but also the bigger picture. The social and cultural context. Definitely a lot more to explore here. But before we do, let's talk about some of the common features and, well, the not-so-common features we see in these laws globally.
Sounds good. We can unpack those key concepts and legal considerations that actually affect how these laws are applied in real life.
Sounds like a plan. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's kind of shift gears a bit and look at some of the common threads and some of the finer points when it comes to these Good Samaritan laws. One of the big ones is this idea of a duty to assist. Some places, they actually require you to help someone in need, even if it's just calling 911 or whatever your emergency number is.
So you can't just walk on by someone who's clearly injured without, at least picking up the phone.
Nope, not in those places. It kind of underlines that being a good citizen means actually doing something, not just watching. Like in the U.S., states like Minnesota, Vermont, Rhode Island, they all have laws on the books requiring some kind of assistance if there's an emergency.
So it's not just a moral thing, it's actually the law.
It is.
Seems like there's a fine line between encouraging good deeds and straight up requiring them.
Oh, for sure. It's a balancing act. And it gets even more complex when you bring in the concept of imminent peril. A lot of these laws only kick in when the person you're helping is in, immediate, serious danger.
So a minor injury might not be enough to qualify for protection.
It might not, and that can be hard to figure out when you're right there in the moment.
Yeah, how are you supposed to know?
Yeah.
Especially if it's a split-second decision.
Not always easy, and that's why it's so important to have at least a general idea of how the laws work wherever you are. There was actually a case in California. Someone pulled a victim from a car wreck trying to do the right thing, but ended up causing more injuries. And the court decided the Good Samaritan law didn't apply because the victim wasn't in immediate life-threatening danger.
That's tough. It really makes you think. Okay, so what about, getting paid for helping? Does that change things?
Yeah, that's another key factor. Most Good Samaritan laws are really about protecting people who help without expecting any kind of payment.
So if you're a doctor off duty and you help someone, it might not count.
Right. These laws are mostly for everyday folks, not pros doing their job, even if it's outside of work.
Right. It wouldn't be fair to hold, a trained professional to the same standards as someone with just basic first aid knowledge.
Exactly. And there are variations on how these laws deal with, well, what happens if the Good Samaritan was somehow involved in the incident to begin with?
Like that tripping example you mentioned.
Exactly. Some places might limit your protection in those cases, while others care more about whether you were genuinely trying to help.
So even when you're looking at those common themes, it's still kind of a patchwork of different approaches.
It is, and we're just scratching the surface, really. Another big thing is this obligation to remain. A lot of times, once you start helping someone, you've got to stay with them until you can hand them off to someone more qualified, like paramedics or other first responders.
So no popping in, doing CPR, then running off to grab a latte.
Haha. Right. You've got a duty to see it through once you've started. Obviously, there are exceptions, like if you have to call for help or it becomes unsafe for you to stay.
That makes sense. You don't want people just bailing on someone who needs help because they get scared or whatever.
Exactly. Okay, now, really important, consent. Unless it's a life or death situation where the person is unconscious or can't communicate, you've got to get their consent before you do anything.
So even if I'm trying to help, I could get in trouble for touching someone without their permission.
It's true. Battery's still a thing, even with good intentions. Luckily, a lot of places recognize implied consent. If someone's clearly out of it, it's assumed they'd want help.
That makes sense. It would be pretty messed up to get sued for helping someone who's passed out and can't literally say yes to your help.
Right. And there are special rules for kids. Usually got to get consent from a parent or guardian before helping a minor, unless they're not around or they're incapacitated themselves.
Man, there's a lot more to these laws than meets the eye. Definitely not as straightforward as I thought.
It's true. These laws, they're trying to strike a balance, encourage people to help, but also protect individual rights. And as we've seen, different countries, different cultures, they find that balance in very different ways.
Totally. Okay, before we move on, can we circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the difference between Good Samaritan laws and duty to rescue laws?
Sure.
Remind me what that distinction is again.
So Good Samaritan laws are mostly about offering protection to those who choose to help. It's about removing the obstacles, letting people help without fear. Duty to rescue laws, on the other hand, actually make it a requirement to help in certain situations.
So in some places, you could get in trouble for not helping, even if you weren't the one who caused the problem.
Exactly. Very different approach. More common in those civil law countries like France, Germany, the US, Canada. They tend to lean more towards encouraging people to help rather than making them do it.
So it's more about giving people the choice, but then having their back if they do decide to get involved.
You got it. Freedom to choose, but also that safety net if they do step up.
This has been really eye-opening. It's clear that these laws are about more than just legalities. They show us what different societies value, how they see our duties to each other.
It's true.
Okay, before we wrap up this part, any, common misconceptions about these laws that you've come across?
Oh, tons. One of the big ones is that people think they offer this total immunity. Like, as long as you meant well, nothing bad can happen to you legally. But like we've talked about, these laws are much more complicated than that.
Right, it's not just a free pass to do whatever you want. There are still those concepts of reasonable assistance, imminent peril, that need for consent, all that.
Exactly. And another misconception is that they only apply to medical emergencies. While those are definitely common, Good Samaritan laws can cover other situations too, like helping someone get out of a fire or stopping a crime.
That's a good point. It's about encouraging people to do the right thing, period. Not just in medical situations.
Right. And the last one I hear a lot is that people think these laws mean you don't need common sense anymore. They figure the law will always protect them, so they don't have to be careful or anything.
That's a little scary, honestly.
It can be. These laws are about encouraging responsible action, not being reckless. Gotta remember, while they offer some protection, they shouldn't replace using your own judgment, knowing your limits, and acting within your capabilities.
So it's about being a good Samaritan, but also a smart one.
Exactly. Compassion and carefulness, gotta have both.
This has been really insightful. I feel like I'm seeing all these laws and what they represent in a whole new light.
Good.
So as we get closer to the end of our deep dive here, what's the big takeaway you want people to walk away with?
It really is about, thinking about what each society values. Like, how do they see that balance between individual freedom and, well, the good of the group? And it's not just about laws, it's about culture, history, even philosophy. All that plays a part.
Makes you wonder what the perfect good Samaritan law would even look like.
Yeah.
Is it about finding that sweet spot between encouraging help and respecting individual choice?
Hmm.
Or is there a whole other way of looking at it?
Yeah, that's a tough one. No easy answers there. Each society has to figure it out for themselves based on their own situation. So many things to consider,
Yeah.
cultural values, legal traditions, ethics, and of course, what actually works in practice.
Right.
What's good in one place might not be the best fit somewhere else.
Definitely highlights that there's no one solution that fits everyone. It's about finding what works best for each specific society.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that never really ends. Societies change, new things come up, and the way we think about these laws, our responsibility to each other, that's likely to change too.
That's an interesting point. So they're not just set in stone, they kind of reflect how we see things, how those views change over time.
Exactly. They evolve with us, you could say.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive here, what's the final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Whether a country has a Good Samaritan law or doesn't have one, it all comes down to a fundamental question we all have to face. How do we balance that urge to help others with the reality that we can't force people to be heroes? Tough question, no easy answers, but it's one worth thinking about. After all, any one of us could be in a situation where we need help, or we have the chance to offer it.
That's a good point. It really makes you think about your own values, how you'd react in those situations.
Exactly. This isn't just some abstract legal stuff, it's real life. It affects us all.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the world of Good Samaritan laws. We hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as we've enjoyed talking about it.
Absolutely.
And to our listeners, we'll see you next time. Keep those brains buzzing.